Biblio Studio presents The Keys of Infinity, Universal Principles of Hermeticism. Chapter 1. The Mind as the Forge of the Universe. Imagine that everything you know, your body, your home, the stars and the oceans, were nothing more than a representation within a vast mental stage. The idea may seem strange, even unsettling. But what if material reality were, in essence, a thought sustained in an infinite mind? We are not speaking here of cheap illusions or of denying the existence of the physical world. What we are trying to do is take a step further, to recognize that what is visible may be the result of an invisible process, that what is solid and tangible rests upon the mental. This is neither a modern notion nor a philosophical whim. From the Vedic sages of India to Islamic mystics, through medieval alchemists and contemporary scientists, many have intuited that the mind is not a secondary product of the universe, but its very foundation. In the 17th century, a rather obscure Polish thinker, Michał Sędziwój, better known by his Latinized name, Sendivogius, wrote an alchemical treatise in which he affirmed that everything that exists comes from a celestial seed sown in matter. According to him, that seed was not physical, but an invisible spark that gave shape and direction to the material. Later commentators debated whether to interpret this as metaphor or literal doctrine, but the essence remains. Even back then, it was intuited that the mental precedes the material. Today, we might translate that idea into more accessible language. What we think, what we imagine, what we believe to be possible, shapes the way reality unfolds before us. Our thoughts are not mere passive reflections of what happens. They act as lenses that intensify certain aspects of the world and weaken others. We do not see things as they are, but as we filter them through our convictions, expectations, and fears. Consider a simple example. Two travelers arrive in an unfamiliar city. The first, convinced that people are hostile, will perceive cold looks in the passers-by, interpret the silence of waiters as disdain, and recall every unpleasant gesture as confirmation of his prejudice. The second, open and trusting, will see smiles, interpret silences as mere shyness, and cherish gestures of hospitality. Both will have walked the same streets, but each will have inhabited a different universe. What is fascinating is that neither of those subjective universes is less real than the other. On a practical level, the mental state of each traveler becomes the concrete texture of his experience. Thus, the mind does not merely interpret reality, it generates it, shapes it, and fills it with meaning. If this occurs on the individual scale, what prevents us from thinking that something similar happens on the universal scale? Perhaps everything we call cosmos is the expression of a greater infinite mind, one that sustains galaxies as we sustain a dream. The Greek philosophers already suspected something similar. Anaxagoras, for example, spoke of the nous, the ordering intelligence that gives form to chaos. In Chinese tradition, the Tao appears as a mysterious force that manifests in all things while simultaneously transcending them. And in Jewish mysticism, the Ein Sof is described as an inconceivable infinitude from which creation flows. Different names, same intuition. Behind the multiplicity of forms pulses an immaterial source that originates and sustains them. Someone might object, all this sounds inspiring, but what practical use is there in thinking that the universe is mental? The answer is more than you imagine. Because if we accept that material reality is linked to the mental, then every thought, every emotion, every belief acquires enormous weight. They are not mere inner shadows. They are seeds that germinate in our actions, in our relationships, and at times in the events that surround us. Allow me to recall an anecdote recorded by an Arab chronicler of the 13th century. In the city of Basra lived a poet named Yusuf, who used to wander through the market reciting verses about the abundance and beauty of life, even though he barely had enough to eat. People considered him eccentric, but over time curious things began to happen. A merchant hired him as a copyist. A family took him in as a tutor for their children, and eventually he was invited to the court to compose odes. Yusuf maintained that he had done nothing extraordinary except inhabit mentally a garden of prosperity, even when his surroundings were barren. His mind sowed fertile ground where, sooner or later, reality blossomed. This story reminds us that the mind is not a mere mirror of the world, but a crucible where the possible is forged. When we firmly maintain an inner vision, sooner or later we find resonances in the external. This is not superficial magic, but a deep law. Like attracts like, what is intensely thought seeks its channel in experience. At this point, a warning is in order. Recognizing the creative power of the mind does not mean falling into the naivety of believing that merely wishing for something makes it appear instantly. Reality is more complex. It is formed of multiple forces, causes, and wills interacting. Our thoughts are one of those forces, powerful but not omnipotent. To pretend otherwise would be like supposing that a single instrument could compose an entire symphony on its own. What is within our reach is to learn to direct the inner orchestra. Every emotion, every belief, every word repeated in silence acts as a note that vibrates in the great concert of life. When we tune those notes, when we cultivate clear and elevated thoughts, our existence begins to resonate differently. And that resonance attracts experiences, people, and opportunities that previously seemed distant. A Zen master of 15th century Japan expressed it with a memorable image. He said that the mind is like a garden surrounded by invisible walls. Within that space, all kinds of plants grow. Some bear nourishing fruit, others poisonous thorns. The task of the apprentice is not to destroy the garden, but to learn to care for it, to pull out what poisons, water what nourishes, and above all to understand that what blooms outside always reflects what we cultivate inside. Thus, the first principle we present in this book is clear. The mind is the forge of the universe. Everything that exists, both personal and cosmic, first arises as an idea, as a mental vibration, before taking material form. If you accept this, even as a hypothesis, your way of walking through life will change. Because every thought becomes an act of creation, every belief a mold into which reality pours its substance. This principle does not aim to close the mystery, but to open it. If the universe is mental, we are called to be co-creators, not mere spectators. The mind is not a locked room, but a window to the infinite. And even if we do not yet fully grasp its scope, it is enough to begin using it consciously for life to start unfolding new possibilities. The question that accompanies us then is, what are we forging in our mind? A universe of fear, limitation, and suspicion? Or a universe of trust, expansion, and meaning? The answer is not given in words, but in every thought we cultivate day by day. The journey is only beginning, but we already hold the first key in our hands. Reality is mental, and in the mind, the door to all mysteries opens. Chapter 2. The Mirror of Worlds. There is an ancient Arab proverb that says, "He who knows himself knows the universe." It is not merely a poetic phrase, It expresses a profound and universal intuition present in multiple traditions. What happens in the vast spheres of the cosmos finds reflection in the intimacy of the human being, and what occurs in inner life resonates in some way with outer reality. This principle, which we might call correspondence, is summed up in a simple and powerful maxim: what is above is below, and what is below is above. But what does this statement mean in practice? How can we recognize such correspondence without falling into naive superstition? Let us begin with a little-known historical example. In the 4th century BCE, Babylonian astronomers observed with fascination the movements of Venus, that brilliant planet appearing in the sky at dawn or dusk. They discovered that its cycles coincided almost exactly with those of female fertility. This was not just a curious fact. For them, that synchronicity revealed that celestial rhythms and human rhythms were not separate realities, but expressions of the same cosmic dance. What was above, the planetary movement, was reflected below, in human bodies, as though there were an invisible bond between them. Today, even without sharing ancient astrological beliefs, we can recognize the force of that intuition. Natural cycles and human cycles are intertwined. The lunar tide affects the oceans, and subtly our emotional states as well. The seasons shape agriculture, but also our moods. We are not islands, we are reflections of a greater order. This principle of correspondence can be applied in many directions. Consider, for instance, medieval Gothic architecture. The builders of cathedrals designed temples as earthly replicas of an ordered cosmos. Every arch pointed to the heavens. Every stained glass window reproduced a fragment of creation. Entering a cathedral was not merely about finding a space for prayer, but about experiencing the inhabiting of a microcosm that reflected the macrocosm. Thus, the believer did not perceive himself as an isolated being, but as a spark within the vastness that contained him. Something similar occurs in the human body. Ancient Indian physicians, in the Ayurvedic tradition, spoke of nadis and chakras as channels and centers corresponding to cosmic forces. Though the terms may differ, the idea persists. What occurs within reflects what occurs without, and vice versa. We can illustrate this with a closer example. Have you noticed how the state of a community often reflects itself in the face of its streets? Where cohesion, trust, and creativity prevail, the walls are painted in vivid colors, the parks flourish, and the markets overflow with vitality. By contrast, where fear or hostility dominate, the city itself seems to wither. Gray walls multiply, bars and fences abound, neglect spreads. Society, that collective body, responds like a mirror to the mental state of those who inhabit it. This phenomenon is not mere coincidence. It reminds us that the inner and the outer are not two separate worlds, but two sides of the same fabric. What we cultivate in the mind and the heart inevitably manifests, sooner or later, in the matter around us. In the 12th century, the Sufi philosopher Ibn Arabi wrote, "Man is a mirror in which God contemplates his own creation, and the universe is a mirror in which man contemplates his soul." This image of crossed mirrors helps us understand the dynamic of correspondence. Each plane reflects the other, and in that play of reflections, knowledge is revealed that would otherwise remain hidden. Hence, to know the vast, we may observe the small. A snowflake contains in its geometry the laws of universal symmetry. The beating of a human heart reflects the rhythms of expansion and contraction present in entire galaxies. The breath entering and leaving our lungs obeys the same principle of ebb and flow that governs the movement of the tides. We might ask ourselves, how can we apply this principle in daily life? The answer is twofold. First, by looking within. If we wish to understand what is happening around us, it is worth observing what vibrations, thoughts, or emotions we are harboring within. Often we blame the external world for our misfortunes, without recognizing that our inner attitudes are the mold that gives shape to what we experience. Second, by looking outward. The events we encounter in life are not mere accidents. They are mirrors reflecting aspects of ourselves we may not yet know. A conflict with another person may reveal an unresolved inner struggle. An unexpected opportunity may expose a deep desire we had not yet acknowledged. The universe communicates with us through correspondences, and learning to read them is an art. There exists a peculiar story that illustrates this. A Renaissance manuscript recounts how a German alchemist, while distilling sulfur and mercury in his laboratory, began to have recurring dreams of a raven devouring the sun's light. Confused, he consulted a local mystic who told him, "The raven does not dwell in your flasks, but in your heart. You have allowed resentment to extinguish your inner fire, and the laboratory only reflects that state." The alchemist then understood that his failure in chemical operations was not due to the materials, but to his own shadow. When he worked on reconciling his emotions, his experiments began to bear fruit. Beyond the historical veracity of the anecdote, the lesson is clear. What happens outside corresponds to what happens inside. Denying that correspondence is like covering a mirror. It does not erase the image, it only prevents us from seeing it. By accepting this principle, our relationship with the world changes. We cease to feel like victims of external circumstances and begin to understand that each situation contains a message, an echo of our interior, or a reflection of a greater order. This does not mean blaming ourselves for everything that occurs, but recognizing that we are woven into the same fabric of correspondences. By observing nature with this perspective, we discover that everything speaks to us. A tree growing crooked can teach us resilience. The flocking flight of birds can remind us of the power of silent cooperation. The fire that consumes and transforms wood speaks to us of the energy that also burns in our passions. Nothing is disconnected. Everything corresponds to everything. Of course, this principle must not be interpreted simplistically. It is not about forcing arbitrary correspondences or seeking magical signs in every event. True wisdom consists in cultivating an open and deep gaze, capable of capturing authentic resonances. Sometimes correspondence reveals itself as a sudden flash of understanding, at other times as a slow process perceptible only with distance. The key is to remain attentive. For the universe, like a patient teacher, constantly offers us hints and mirrors. We only need to learn to read them. What occurs on one plane finds its echo in others. The microcosm reflects the macrocosm, and the macrocosm inscribes itself in the microcosm. To know one is, in some way, to know the other. When we look at a cell, a city, or a galaxy, we are witnessing the same dance, unfolded on different scales. And when we observe ourselves with honesty, we discover that within us, we carry the reflection of the entire universe. What is above is below, and what is below is above. The mirror is set. Chapter 3. The Universe in Motion. If you have ever placed your ear close to a seashell, you will have heard a murmur resembling the sound of the sea. That sound does not come from an ocean trapped inside the shell, but from the vibration of the air within it. The invisible becomes audible through subtle movement. In the same way, everything that exists vibrates, even what we consider solid and immutable. The entire universe is not a static block, but a symphony in constant motion. The principle of vibration affirms precisely this. Nothing is motionless, everything moves, everything vibrates. From the atoms dancing in matter to the thoughts coursing through the mind, all participate in the same dynamism. Understanding this not only brings us closer to the root of the cosmos, but allows us to transform the way we inhabit the world. The ancients intuited this long before modern science confirmed it. In a papyrus found in Thebes, creation is described as the dance of millions of tiny lights spiraling in motion. In the Vedic tradition, the universe is conceived as a primordial sound, Om, whose vibrations gave birth to all forms. And the pre-Socratic philosophers, such as Heraclitus, taught that reality was nothing but ceaseless flux. No man ever steps into the same river twice. Today, atomic physics reminds us of the same truth. What we call matter is, at its core, energy vibrating at different frequencies. The table on which you rest this book may seem solid, but within it, electrons spin at unimaginable speeds. The difference between a stone and a flower, between a wave and a song, lies in the frequency and intensity of their vibrations. This principle is not merely a scientific or philosophical fact. It is a practical key for understanding life. Observe how your own moods change. Some days you feel light, almost dancing. Others you are wrapped in heaviness like a cloak. That variation is not due solely to external circumstances, but to the inner vibration that predominates within you. Fear, anger, and sadness vibrate at low frequencies. Joy, gratitude, and compassion vibrate at higher ones. A 13th century Tibetan monk wrote in his diary, "When I chant mantras, I feel my thoughts become as light as birds. It is not that reality changes immediately, but my heart vibrates differently, and with it, the world vibrates too." His words illustrate a profound truth. When we change the frequency of our mind and heart, the way we perceive and create reality also changes. Music is a perfect example of this principle. A taut string vibrates and produces a sound. Varying the tension changes the note. The same occurs in our lives. By changing the vibration, we change the melody we emit. A medieval chronicle recounts that the Arab physician Al-Farabi could alter the moods of a crowd simply by playing his lute. One mode made listeners laugh, another moved them to tears, another lulled them to sleep. Beyond the exaggeration of legend, we now know that music directly affects our brain waves and emotions. The external vibrates in resonance with the internal. This principle extends beyond the individual. Entire societies vibrate. When a community is dominated by fear, suspicion, and hostility, the collective vibration becomes dense and dark, generating violence and distrust. Conversely, when trust, cooperation, and hope prevail, that vibration expands and spreads, generating a virtuous circle. The Greek historian Plutarch recounts that, in ancient Sparta, before going to war, warriors gathered in rhythmic song. They believed that by vibrating together, in unison, they became invincible. And though their enemies might outnumber them, the shared resonance gave them superior strength. It was not magic. It was the power of a common vibration. How can we apply this principle in our lives? The first lesson is that we cannot escape vibration. We constantly emit and receive waves, thoughts, emotions, words, gestures. The question is not whether we vibrate, but how we vibrate. When we keep our mind in constant worry, we generate a vibratory field that attracts more of the same, situations and people that reinforce anxiety. By contrast, if we cultivate thoughts of serenity and gratitude, our vibration changes, and with it, so do our experiences. A modern example is found in studies of what is called heart coherence. Researchers discovered that when a person sustains deep, positive emotional states, the heart emits a harmonic, vibratory pattern that affects even those nearby. In other words, our vibration not only transforms us, but also others. The principle of vibration also invites us to understand suffering differently. Many times we believe that states of sadness or fear are punishments or personal flaws. But if everything is vibration, then those states are simply denser frequencies, not eternal condemnations. And just as a musician can change the note of an instrument, we can learn to raise the frequency of our mind and heart. This does not mean denying difficult emotions, but recognizing that they are part of the scale. Hatred is not essentially different from love. They are notes at opposite ends of the same string. The task is to move from one end to the other, modulating vibration until reaching harmony. There is a metaphor used by Sufi mystics. They compared the soul to a drum. If the skin is too loose, the sound is weak and out of tune. If it is too tight, it breaks. But if it reaches the right tension, the drum resounds with strength and beauty. The same occurs with us. Finding the right tension in our vibration allows us to emit an authentic sound in harmony with the symphony of the universe. This principle also explains why certain spiritual practices emphasize silence, breathing, and the repetition of sacred words. All of them seek to modify the vibration of consciousness. Silence is not the absence of sound, but a fine and subtle vibration that connects us with higher planes. Breathing regulates the flow of energy, and words repeated with intention act as waves that transform our inner being. In an Orthodox monastery in Georgia, a prayer has been preserved that monks once repeated softly for hours. Light in my mind, peace in my heart. It was not a magical spell, but a way of vibrating in harmony. Repeated thousands of times, that phrase became a current that shaped consciousness and opened it to new perceptions. Matter, energy, mind, and spirit all participate in the same movement. The difference between the various planes is not one of nature, but of frequency. The denser vibrates slowly, the subtler with infinite speed. Understanding this gives us immense power. We can learn to modulate our own vibration. We can decide whether to remain in the low note of fear or rise to the resonance of love. We can recognize that the reality we experience is, to a large extent, the music we emit and receive. The universe is a symphony in motion, and each of us is at once both instrument and musician. Chapter 4. The Two Faces of Unity. The world seems to be made of contrasts, light and darkness, cold and heat, life and death. From the moment we open our eyes to existence, we find ourselves thrown into a universe where everything has its opposite. This clash of forces has been a source of anguish and searching since the dawn of humanity. How can we reconcile the apparent war between opposites? The principle of polarity offers a key. Opposites are not separate realities, but poles of the same thing. A striking example comes from modern physics. Light, which we sometimes regard as a wave and at other times as a particle, is neither one nor the other exclusively. It is both, depending on how it is observed. What seem to be irreconcilable opposites, wave and particle, turn out to be expressions of the same reality. This scientific paradox elegantly reflects the teaching of the ancients. extremes meet. Opposites are identical in nature, though differing in degree. Heat and cold illustrate the idea in a more familiar way. Both are manifestations of the same energy, the movement of molecules. There is no absolute cold distinct from heat. What we call cold is simply less movement, less heat. The same is true of darkness and light. The former is nothing but a relative absence of the latter. The Persian poet Rumi told a parable that illustrates this principle. A thirsty traveler found two wells in the desert. One contained fresh, sweet water, the other bitter and salty water. The man lamented the injustice of nature, but a passing sage said to him, "Both springs rise from the same ground. The difference lies in the salts that mix along the way. Learn to see that the source is one." In the same way, the opposites we experience in life do not arise from warring realities, but from variations of the same current. Hatred and love, so different in appearance, are emotions vibrating at opposite ends of the same affective scale. Indifference is not their opposite, but rather the absence of that intensity. Understanding this principle transforms the way we face conflict. So often, we are trapped in the rigidity of absolute thinking. This is good, that is bad. This person is a friend, that one an enemy. But if every pair of opposites belongs to the same essence, we can learn to move along that scale instead of being stuck at one extreme. A little-known historical example comes from ancient China. The strategist Sun Bin, a descendant of Sun Tzu's school, advised generals not to fight the enemy head-on, but to transform the energy of confrontation into advantage. He said, "Defeat and victory are brothers. Do not separate them, move them toward one another." His words, seemingly military, concealed a universal teaching. What appears as opposition can become an ally if we understand its common root. This principle does not mean that everything is indifferent or that extremes have no consequences. Intense cold can kill as surely as scorching heat. Hatred can destroy what love builds. But wisdom lies in understanding that both are part of the same string, and that we can learn to move along it consciously. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus expressed it brilliantly. What disturbs men is not things themselves, but their judgments about them. In other words, the way we polarize our perception determines the quality of our experience. We can apply this to inner life. When we feel fear, we often believe we must eliminate it, tear it out like a weed. Yet the principle of polarity invites another view. Fear is not the enemy of courage, but its opposite pole. Cultivating courage does not mean denying fear, but moving along the spectrum from one frequency to the other. Likewise, despair and hope are not disconnected worlds. They are stations on the same road. One who is in despair does not need to invent hope from nothing, but to shift consciousness a few degrees toward the light. A medieval story tells of a Benedictine monk, tormented by doubt in his faith, who went to his abbot and confessed, "Father, I feel full of unbelief." The abbot replied, "Then you already have the seed of faith. Unbelief is not total absence, but faith that has not yet matured. Nurture it, and it will grow." That counsel sums up the essence of the principle of polarity. What seems its opposite is, in truth, an incipient form of what we seek. The natural world offers us endless examples. Day becomes night, and night becomes day. The tide rises and falls. The seed dies in the earth to give life to the plant. Ice melts into water, and water evaporates into vapor. None of these transitions implies absolute rupture. They are movements from one pole to the other. In understanding this, we cease to see change as a threat and begin to recognize it as opportunity. If everything can turn into its opposite, then no situation is final. Pain can become wisdom, loss, openness, death, birth. This principle also provides us with a practical tool, the conscious transmutation of polarity. Instead of being prisoners of a negative state, we can shift it toward its contrary. A simple exercise is to observe the emotion present and ask, what is its opposite on the same scale? If we feel resentment, its opposite is understanding. If we are in sadness, its opposite is joy. By recognizing the scale, we discover that movement is possible. The ancient alchemists called this the art of polarizing. It was not a poetic metaphor, but a real practice, to move consciousness from one pole to the other as one moves a compass needle. There is a curious passage in the writings of Giordano Bruno, the Renaissance philosopher condemned for heresy. He claimed that fire and water, so contrary, were in fact accomplices in the great theater of the cosmos. Fire transforms the solid into vapor, and water extinguishes fire to give way to life. For Bruno, this dance of opposites revealed the secret unity of existence. Perhaps that is why his work, far from dying with him at the stake, inspired generations after him. Polarity does not destroy, but fertilizes. Everything is dual, everything has two poles. Understanding this does not mean denying differences, but seeing beyond them. When we recognize that opposites are degrees of the same essence, we regain the freedom to move, to transform, to transmute. Life ceases to be a war of absolutes and becomes a dance of contrasts. And in that dance we discover that darkness is not the enemy of light, but its companion, that death is not contrary to life, but part of its cycle, that pain does not negate joy, but makes it more intense. The two faces in the end are one. Chapter 5. The Dance of the Pendulum. If you watch the sea from a cliff, you'll see that the waves never rest. They rise and fall, retreat and advance, as if breathing. The entire universe breathes in this way, in cycles, in pulsations, in oscillations. Nothing remains forever in ascent, nor forever in decline. Everything follows a rhythm. This movement, flowing from one pole to the other, is the expression of a profound principle. Everything flows and ebbs, everything rises and falls, everything moves like a pendulum. This principle of rhythm was first observed by ancient astronomers as they gazed at the heavens. Day follows night, winter follows summer, the new moon waxes into fullness. The regularity of these cycles became humanity's first calendar. It was not only a tool to measure time, but a lesson in wisdom. Everything has its season. In pharaonic Egypt, the priests taught that even the gods obeyed rhythm. Osiris died and was reborn, symbolizing the cycle of vegetation. In Greece, Demeter wept for the loss of her daughter Persephone, who descended into the underworld each winter, only to return each spring. These tales were not merely agricultural myths, but symbols of a universal truth. All things live in oscillation. Curiously, modern physics confirms this intuition. The electron does not move in a straight line, but in vibrations and orbits. The heart beats in rhythmic pulses. Even galaxies revolve in cycles of expansion and contraction. The great and the small, the visible and the invisible, obey the same law. But the most fascinating oscillation does not occur outside. It happens within us. The mind also follows the pendulum's swing. We feel euphoric and then melancholy, motivated and then weary, full of faith and then overwhelmed by doubt. These oscillations are as natural as the tide. The mistake lies in believing we should remain fixed at one extreme. A Zen monk of 12th century Japan wrote in his diary, "When sadness visits me, I do not reject it. I recognize it as the other face of joy. I know it will smile again within me, for the wheel never stops turning." His attitude reflects the wisdom of accepting rhythm instead of fighting against it. When we resist the natural swing, we suffer. We want happiness to last forever and pain to vanish forever. But the pendulum does not stop. To wish it would is like trying to freeze the sea into a single perfect wave. Life does not freeze, it flows. History offers astonishing examples of this principle in action. Consider the rise and fall of empires. Babylon, Rome, Byzantium, all ascended in power and splendor, and all fell into decline. This is neither curse nor accident, but rhythm. When a civilization reaches its peak, it inevitably begins its descent, preparing the ground for new growth. The 14th century Arab historian Ibn Khaldun was among the first to express this clearly. In his Muqaddimah, he described how dynasties are born, vigorous, grow, corrupt themselves, and die, following a cycle that may span centuries. What is remarkable is that he saw this movement not as tragedy, but as natural law. On a personal level, we experience these cycles as well. Creativity, for example, is never constant. There are periods of intense inspiration and periods of apparent drought. Yet what we call drought is not emptiness, but incubation. The pendulum is retreating to gather force. The Renaissance painter Piero di Cosimo would sometimes spend weeks without painting, doing nothing but observing insects or contemplating clouds. His contemporaries accused him of idleness, but then, suddenly, extraordinary works flowed from his brush, filled with meticulous detail. Perhaps he understood, without naming it, that his mind obeyed rhythm and that rest was as necessary as action. How, then, can we apply this principle in our lives? The key is the conscious neutralization of the pendulum. Though we cannot stop the oscillation, we can learn not to be dragged blindly by it. When we are in a state of enthusiasm, we know the pendulum will swing back toward calm. Instead of fearing that descent, we can use it to rest and prepare. And when we fall into sadness, we can remember we will not remain there forever. The pendulum will carry us back toward joy. This understanding gives rise to equanimity. The principle of rhythm also invites us to look beyond the extremes. We often think the pendulum moves only back and forth, but in truth it moves in a spiral. Each oscillation brings us to a different level, like day and night, which follow one another but are never identical. There is always a new nuance, a variation in the season. Life does not repeat cycles mechanically. It unfolds them as a dance. The pendulum does not return to exactly the same point, but traces an ascending or descending path, depending on how we use it. That is our freedom, to decide whether the oscillations stagnate us or elevate us. In spiritual alchemy, this principle was expressed by the symbol of the Ouroboros, the serpent that bites its own tail. It represented the idea of an infinite cycle of destruction and creation, death and rebirth. But in many manuscripts, the Ouroboros was drawn as a spiral, not a perfect circle, indicating that the cycle leads to a new level of consciousness. By accepting this principle, our view of pain changes radically. Suffering is not an abyss without exit, but part of the pendulum's swing, preparing the return to light. Likewise, joy is not an eternal gift, but a peak that will inevitably give way to descent. Wisdom consists in learning to flow with that movement rather than resisting it. When we grasp this, we can walk through life with new serenity. Neither euphoria intoxicates us completely, nor misfortune crushes us forever. We know the pendulum will continue its course, and in that certainty we find freedom. Everything flows and ebbs, everything rises and falls. Rhythm governs life in all its planes. We cannot escape it, but we can learn to move with it. Chapter 6. The Invisible Thread of Cause. Chance is a comfortable refuge. When something happens without our being able to explain it, we usually call it coincidence. Yet behind that word lies more ignorance than wisdom. The principle of cause and effect teaches us that nothing occurs without a prior cause, and everything we do becomes the cause of something yet to come. There is no whimsy in the universe, but rather a web of invisible connections. The Greek philosophers already affirmed this. Democritus, the thinker of atoms, held that even what we call chance is nothing more than the encounter of causal chains unknown to us. Later, Aristotle developed the notion of cause on different levels: material, formal, efficient, and final. Everything has a root, a form that shapes it, an agent that produces it, and an end that directs it. In India, the sages spoke of karma, a word that literally means action. Every act, however insignificant it may seem, generates an echo that inevitably returns. Karma is not punishment nor reward, but consequence. We sow, and life, sooner or later, returns the harvest. A little-cited historical example appears in the Byzantine chronicles. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian banned certain games of chance in Constantinople, convinced they threatened social order. But instead of eliminating the problem, the prohibition created a flourishing underground market. The cause, a strict law, produced the opposite of its intended effect. It multiplied what it sought to suppress. This anecdote shows that it is not enough to know the principle of cause and effect. One must understand it with subtlety. An action triggers a reaction, yes, but not always in a linear way. Effects can appear disguised, delayed, or amplified, like echoes that resound long after. In our daily lives, this principle is at work constantly. If we sow habits of negligence, the effects will eventually show themselves in health, relationships, or work. If we cultivate discipline and attention, the fruits will not appear immediately, but they will come with certainty. What we live today is largely the result of causes we planted yesterday. This does not mean that everything is rigidly predetermined. Freedom does not vanish, it simply shifts. We cannot avoid reaping what we have already sown, but we can decide what new seeds to plant from now on. In this sense, every action is the cause of a still malleable future. A mystic of the Syrian desert in the 10th century told a striking parable. A young man asked him why his life was filled with misfortune. The master gave him a sack of seeds and said, "Plant them in the garden." The young man did so, but soon complained, "These seeds bear bitter fruit." The master replied, "Then why do you expect sweetness if what you planted was bitter?" The youth understood the lesson. He could not blame destiny for what he himself had sown with his actions and thoughts. The principle of cause and effect is also evident in the history of ideas. Great philosophical and scientific revolutions do not emerge out of nothing. They are the result of invisible causes accumulated over centuries. The European Enlightenment, for example, was the effect of multiple prior causes: the rediscovery of classical texts in the Renaissance, the invention of the printing press, the voyages of exploration, the religious crisis of the Reformation. What seems at first glance to be a sudden explosion is, in reality, the unfolding of a long, silent process. The danger lies in confusing this principle with blind fatalism. To recognize that everything has a cause does not mean resigning ourselves to passivity. On the contrary, It invites us to assume responsibility. Every word we speak, every gesture, every thought is a causal seed. And although we cannot always foresee all the effects, we know with certainty that none is ever lost. The Stoic sages expressed it clearly. It is not within your power to control the effects, but you can control the causes you set in motion. In other words, human freedom consists in sowing the best we can, trusting that the universal fabric will return its fruit in due time. There is also the other side of this principle. Everything we receive is the effect of previous causes, some sown by us, others by those who came before. We do not always reap what we sow individually. Often we harvest what a community, a generation, or an entire culture has planted. That is why we share collective destinies. A moving example appears in the history of Iceland. In the 18th century, after centuries of deforestation for timber and fuel, the country was left almost barren of trees. Storms and erosion made life difficult for generations. What one group had sown as a cause, indiscriminate felling, produced effects that endured for centuries. Today, with reforestation programs, Icelanders are planting new causes that will benefit those not yet born. The principle of cause and effect, when deeply understood, frees us from the illusion of chance. Blind luck disappears, and a hidden order begins to reveal itself. Even the most unexpected events form part of causal chains we may not yet see. In a Sufi manuscript, we read the story of a merchant who lost everything in a shipwreck. Desperate, he believed himself the victim of fate. But deprived of his riches, he was forced to live among the poor of his city. There he discovered talents he had never imagined, and in time he founded a school of wisdom that transformed many lives. The shipwreck, which seemed a cruel whim, was in fact a link in a chain of causes that led him to his true purpose. Accepting this principle invites us to a double attitude: responsibility looking forward and understanding looking backward. Looking forward because we know that every action is the seed of future effects. Looking backward because we recognize that what we live today has roots in past causes. This double gaze allows us to live with more awareness and less resentment. Thus we arrive at the sixth key of our journey. Nothing happens by chance. Every phenomenon has its cause, and every action generates its effect. We do not always see the connection immediately, but the invisible thread binds everything that exists. To know this makes us conscious sowers. We can choose what causes to set in motion, what seeds to plant in the garden of time. And though we cannot control every effect, we know at least that we are actively participating in the fabric of reality. Chance fades, and in its place appears responsibility. Every act is a stone cast into the river of existence. Its ripples expand farther than we can imagine. Chapter 7. The Generative Force. In every culture, from the most ancient to the most modern, we find the intuition that life arises from the union of two principles. Sometimes they are called masculine and feminine, at other times active and passive, heaven and earth, spirit and matter. The names vary, but the teaching is the same. Nothing exists without generation, without the interaction of two poles, whose meeting gives rise to the new. Cosmogonic myths express this with grand images. In the Egyptian tradition, the god Atum divides into two principles in order to engender the world. In Chinese mythology, yin and yang are not enemies but complements that, in their intertwining, generate the 10,000 things. In the biblical Genesis, even before the existence of humanity, the Spirit of God moves upon the waters. An active principle and a receptive principle that together initiate creation. The principle of generation reminds us that everything that exists, from the most elemental to the most sublime, arises from this interaction. The universe is not the product of a solitary act, but of the meeting of forces. Modern science offers an unexpected mirror of this intuition. Biology shows us how every known form of life is transmitted through the union of gametes, combining male and female genetic material. Physics, in turn, teaches us that even at the subatomic level, there exist complementary pairs, positive and negative, proton and electron, whose interaction generates matter. Generation is not an accident of organic life, but a universal law. A curious historical example comes from medieval alchemy. Alchemists represented the supreme work, the transmutation of lead into spiritual gold, with the image of a sacred marriage, the red king and the white queen, sulfur and mercury, the masculine and the feminine. In engravings, these figures embrace, merge, and give birth to a new being, the philosophical androgyny, symbol of wholeness. For them, the secret of transformation did not lie in violence, but in the harmonious union of opposites. The principle of generation is not limited to the physical plane. It also rules in the world of ideas. Every creative thought is born from the encounter of two forces, the seed of an intuition and the fertile ground of receptive imagination. Science and art advance by virtue of this principle. Leonardo da Vinci, for instance, was able to unite the masculine quality of rigorous observation with the feminine quality of visionary imagination. The result was a body of work that still seems inexhaustible. Every invention, every painting, every notebook of his is the offspring of that union between attention and openness. In our personal lives, the principle manifests in countless ways. Every time we take an abstract idea, masculine, active, and translate it into concrete action, feminine, receptive, we are generating. Every time we allow a deep emotion to fertilize a clear decision, we are generating. A 13th century Sufi master told his disciples, "The seed of wheat alone cannot yield bread, nor the fertile soil without the seed, but together seed and soil produce abundance. So it is in your heart. You need the force that initiates and the force that receives." This principle has profound implications for self-knowledge. Often we live polarized, cultivating only one aspect of our energy. Some people become excessively active, always seeking to affirm, impose, project. Others take refuge solely in the receptive, waiting, adapting, flowing without deciding. Balance is achieved when both principles live together within us, like the two wings of the same bird. In contemporary psychology, Carl Gustav Jung developed a similar vision when speaking of the anima and the animus, the feminine aspect within man and the masculine aspect within woman. For Jung, inner development required integrating that polarity, reconciling the principles within oneself. A little-known story from the Gnostic tradition recounts that, in the beginning, the human being was created androgynous, with both aspects united. Only later did separation occur, and since then we unconsciously seek the lost union. This is not merely about union with another person, but about inner integration, recovering within ourselves that primordial wholeness. On the spiritual plane, the principle of generation expresses itself as creative power. Our thoughts, united with our will, generate realities. An idea without energy fades. Energy without direction dissipates. But when clear intention meets vital force, conscious creation arises. How can we apply this principle in daily life? First, by recognizing that we are always generating something. Even passivity is a form of generation. By not acting, we engender consequences. The question is not whether we generate, but what we generate. Second, by learning to consciously unite the two principles within us. When an idea arises, ask, have I fertilized it with action? When an emotion overtakes me, ask, have I directed it with clarity? From that encounter arises balanced creation. We can also bring this principle into our relationships. No relationship flourishes if one pole dominates absolutely. In true collaboration, there are moments of giving and moments of receiving, moments of affirming and moments of listening. Where that reciprocity is established, shared life emerges. An example is found in the history of flamenco music. Cante and toque seem like distinct roles. One expresses through the voice, the other responds with the guitar. But in fluid interaction, neither dominates the other. Both fertilize one another and generate something new, unrepeatable. That is the essence of the principle of generation, a creative dialogue. This principle also guards us against stagnation. When a person clings to the unilateral, only action without receptivity, or only receptivity without action, they end in sterility. Life demands fertility, and fertility arises from union. Water alone cannot bear fruit without the seed. The seed alone dies without water. Everything has its masculine and feminine principle, and from their union arises generation. To understand this is to recognize ourselves as creative beings. We are not condemned to mechanically repeat what others have sown. We can generate new realities, new forms of life, new possibilities. And we do so every time we balance within ourselves the active impulse and the receptive openness. The entire universe is an act of generation. Every star that is born, every thought that germinates, every gesture of love that translates into action is testimony to the creative force that flows through us. And that force, far from being the privilege of a few, dwells within us all. Life itself invites us to engender, to co-create, to take part in the mystery of what is being born. Chapter 8. The Fabric of the Laws. Up to this point, we have explored the 7 principles of the Hermetic tradition as if they were separate paths: mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, and generation. But wisdom does not settle for fragmentation. Its goal is integration. And upon closer observation, we discover that the principles are not isolated pieces, but threads that together weave the same universal tapestry. The principle of mentalism establishes that everything is mind, and the other principles are nothing more than expressions of how that infinite mind unfolds. Correspondence teaches us that each plane reflects the other, vibration, that everything is in motion, polarity, that opposites are extremes of the same thing, rhythm, that all things oscillate, cause and effect, that nothing happens by chance, and generation, that everything arises through the union of two forces. When united, a larger vision emerges. The universe is a living mind, expressed through cycles, movements, complementary oppositions, and generative forces. Each principle is like an instrument in the orchestra, but together they produce the full symphony of reality. A fascinating example can be found in ancient medicine. The Hippocratic doctors did not speak of molecules or neurons, but they intuited this network of principles when they spoke of the humors of the body and their balance. For them, health was not the absence of disease, but harmony between opposing forces within a rhythm regulated by mind and environment. The human body was a microcosm obeying the same laws as the macrocosm. This vision, though primitive in scientific terms, grasped a deep truth. One cannot understand the part without the whole, and the same applies to the Hermetic principles. Each one acquires its true meaning only when seen in relation to the others. Let us imagine a seed. Its very existence reveals all the principles at once. Its mental origin lies in the design of nature, which is mind in action. Its development follows correspondence between the small and the great. The seed reproduces in miniature the logic of the tree it will become. Its atoms and molecules are in constant vibration, allowing life to be expressed. Its growth manifests polarity. It needs both sun and shade, heat and cold, moisture and dryness. Its cycle obeys the rhythm of the seasons. It germinates, grows, bears fruit, and dies. Everything that happens to it follows cause and effect. If it receives water and nutrients, it flourishes. If it lacks them, it withers. And finally, it multiplies through generation, uniting pollen and ovule to give rise to new seeds. A simple seed is a living book in which all the principles are written. This fabric invites us to think of life as a system of resonances. A movement on one plane reverberates through the others. That is why a change in our mind, thought, emotion, intention can have consequences for our body, our relationships, and the world around us. A little-known example comes from the tradition of Chinese Taoists. They believed that each organ of the body was connected with emotions and seasons, the liver with spring and anger, the lungs with autumn and sadness, the heart with summer and joy. Beyond the literal, this conception shows an intuition of correspondence and vibration between the physical and the spiritual. The internal and the external are mirrors that affect one another. Applying the principles as a system allows us to approach problems with greater depth. Suppose someone is going through a stage of hopelessness. If we limit ourselves to a single principle, the vision will be incomplete. But by using several together, a clearer map appears. Polarity reminds us that hopelessness is the extreme of the same scale on which hope also resides. Rhythm teaches us that this state will not last forever. The pendulum will swing to the other side. Vibration invites us to raise our frequency through practices that transform inner energy. Cause and effect points out that the current situation is the fruit of prior causes, and that by planting new causes, different effects will be reaped. And generation reveals that only by uniting the active intention with the receptive openness can a new reality be born. The integration of the principles turns hopelessness into a process that can be understood and transformed, not a life sentence. A medieval story illustrates this systemic vision. A pilgrim came to a sage and asked him to reveal the secret of life. The sage showed him a beautiful tapestry and said, "Observe the threads. Do you see that each one by itself seems insignificant? But when interwoven, they form an image. So it is with the universe. Each principle is a thread, but together they weave the whole." The pilgrim understood that it was not enough to cling to a single thread, but that he had to learn to see the complete figure. We also see this pattern in the history of science. Newton discovered the laws of motion and gravitation, but it was Einstein who showed that those laws were part of a greater fabric, space-time. Each discovery is a thread, and deep understanding emerges when they are woven together. In the same way, the Hermetic principles reach their true power when we see them operating as a whole. The practical challenge is to learn to use this system as a compass in life. Faced with any situation, We can ask ourselves, what mental thought originates it? Mentalism. What reflection does it have on other planes? Correspondence. What frequency vibrates within it? Vibration. On which pole is it located, and toward which can it move? Polarity. What cycle is it going through? Rhythm. What causes generated it, and what effects will it produce? Cause and effect. What active and receptive forces participate in it? Generation. These 7 questions form a method of self-knowledge and action. They do not promise to eliminate all difficulties, but they do shed new light upon them. A surprising example comes from the life of the physicist and mathematician Blaise Pascal. Though deeply religious, he was also a rigorous scientist. In his spiritual and scientific writings, one perceives the implicit application of these principles. He sought the cause of phenomena, recognized the polarity between faith and reason, saw correspondences between the human and the divine, and trusted that the universe had a deeper logic than we can perceive. In his famous wager, Pascal did not see chance, but cause and effect. Our choices here give rise to eternal consequences. The principles are not isolated laws, but a living system that interlaces and reflects itself in all things. To understand them in an integrated way allows us to move from fragmentation to wholeness. Life ceases to be incomprehensible chaos and becomes a tapestry in which each thread has its place. The seeker ceases to be a passive spectator and becomes a conscious weaver. And in that act of weaving with the principles, he discovers that reality is not an impossible riddle, but a work in progress in which we all take part. Chapter 9. Inner Governance. The sages of all traditions have repeated an uncomfortable teaching. Before attempting to govern the world, the human being must first learn to govern himself. And it is here where the universal principles cease to be abstract ideas and become practical tools for self-knowledge. The ancient Greeks inscribed on the temple of Apollo at Delphi the phrase, "Know yourself, and you will know the universe and the gods." This maxim precisely summarizes the essence of inner governance. The human being is a microcosm, a miniature reflection of the macrocosm. To understand oneself is, in a way, to understand the whole. The problem is that we often seek outside what we have not yet conquered within. We want to transform others without having transformed our own thoughts. We demand order in the world, while disorder and contradiction reign in our own interior. How can the Hermetic principles be applied to self-knowledge? Let us see, step by step. Mentalism. Everything begins in the mind. The first exercise is to observe the quality of our thoughts. What images do we nourish each day? What inner discourses do we repeat? If the mind is creative, then each thought is a seed of destiny. To govern oneself is to learn to sow fertile thoughts and remove the harmful ones. Correspondence. What happens within is reflected without. If our relationships are chaotic, it is likely that our inner world is too. Instead of blaming only the environment, the seeker must ask, what correspondence exists between my inner world and what I see outside? Vibration. Our emotions vibrate like strings. Prolonged sadness generates heavy environments, while sincere joy attracts lighter resonances. To govern oneself is to learn to modulate vibration, to consciously elevate it through practices, habits, and company that nourish the best within us. Polarity. Within us coexist opposing forces, courage and fear, generosity and selfishness, light and shadow. Inner governance does not consist in denying one side, but in recognizing it and moving toward the pole we wish to strengthen. Rhythm. Our energies rise and fall. To pretend to always be up is naive. The key is to learn to use descent as rest, not as defeat. Self-knowledge includes accepting our personal cycles without guilt or excessive euphoria. Cause and effect. Every decision is a cause in germ. The seeker learns to ask, what effect will this thought, this word, this action have? Anticipating consequences is a form of inner responsibility. Generation. Within us also operate the two principles, active and receptive. True self-governance is born when we balance both. Will that directs, receptivity that listens. From that union arises inner creativity. A story about the Roman Stoics illustrates this teaching well. It is said that Epictetus, born a slave, was brutally beaten by his master until his leg was irreversibly broken. Yet Epictetus calmly remarked, "You warned me you would break my leg, and here it is, broken." He did not say this as passive resignation, but as a demonstration of his inner governance. His body could be subdued, but his mind and his judgment remained free. His attitude embodies the principle of mentalism applied to self-knowledge. Though we cannot control all external causes, we can decide the way in which our mind receives them. Self-governance does not mean repression, but integration. An example can be found in the tradition of yoga. The Hindu sages spoke of the gunas, three forces that coexist within us: sattva, clarity; rajas, activity; and tamas, inertia. The seeker does not eliminate any of them, but learns to recognize when each manifests and to direct them in a balanced way. In the same way, to govern oneself is not to deny anger or fear, but to recognize them, observe them, and move them toward their constructive polarity: fear into prudence, anger into just courage. A practical exercise consists of keeping a correspondence diary. Each night, the seeker writes down 3 external situations that made an impact that day and looks for their internal reflection. For example, if someone insulted him and he reacted with fury, he may ask, "What part of me corresponds to that fury?" This habit gradually reveals how the world is a mirror of one's own inner state. In the Middle Ages, a Carthusian monk wrote a brief treatise called The Mirror of the Soul. There he stated, "The man who contemplates himself sincerely needs no external punishment, for he corrects himself by seeing himself." The metaphor of the mirror is no coincidence. Self-knowledge is learning to look at oneself without masks, to reflect clearly what we are. Inner governance also has another dimension: freedom from the pendulum of rhythm. Many people live dragged along by their moods, rising and falling without direction. The seeker learns not to identify completely with those movements, but to observe them as passing waves. Thus he gains a space of freedom. He can be sad without despairing, joyful without intoxication, serene amid oscillation. The principle of cause and effect, applied to oneself, also teaches responsibility. It is not possible to eternally blame fate, parents, or society. Though all of them are influential causes, each person possesses the ability to plant new causes within. Self-governance begins the day we stop searching for culprits and start planting new seeds. A little remembered historical example is that of Juan de Valdez, a Spanish humanist of the 16th century. In a letter to a friend, he wrote, "We cannot choose the winds, but we can choose the course of the sails." His phrase masterfully sums up the art of self-governance. We do not control external causes, but we do control how we respond to them. Self-knowledge, ultimately, is not an intellectual luxury, but the foundation of freedom. He who does not govern himself is condemned to be governed by his passions, by the oscillations of rhythm, by external causes that drag him along. He who governs himself, on the other hand, begins to become a conscious cause of his own destiny. True power begins within. There is no wisdom without self-knowledge, no freedom without self-governance. The seeker who applies the principles to his inner life becomes the architect of himself. He learns to observe, to direct, to integrate. And from that solid foundation, he can then look at the world with different eyes, no longer as a slave to external forces, but as a conscious collaborator in the work of the universe. Chapter 10. The Art of Relating. If self-knowledge is the first step toward wisdom, the second is learning how to relate. The human being never lives in complete isolation. Even the most solitary hermit maintains invisible ties with the society from which he comes and with the world around him. Our relationships are the most implacable mirror of what we are. It is there that the virtues we believe we have conquered are put to the test, and the shadows we try to hide come to light. The universal principles we have explored not only serve to help us understand ourselves, but also to illuminate the art of living together. For communal life is governed by the same laws that govern the cosmos. Mentalism. Every relationship begins in the mind. The image we hold of the other conditions the way we treat them. If someone believes their partner is an enemy, they will act with distrust. If they believe their partner is an ally, they will act with openness. The relationship is born first in the mental representation. Correspondence. What occurs in our relationships reflects our inner world. A person who despises themselves will tend to project that disdain onto those around them. Conversely, one who values themselves sincerely will create more balanced bonds. Vibration. Emotions spread like waves. A state of anger can drag everyone in a room. A serene attitude can pacify a conflict. Our personal vibrations create collective climates. Polarity. Every relationship oscillates between attraction and rejection, closeness and distance. The secret is in recognizing this polarity without turning it into war. Conflict can be destructive or fruitful, depending on how it is managed. Rhythm. Relationships go through cycles. There are moments of enthusiasm and moments of weariness, periods of intensity and of silence. To expect the relationship always to remain in the same place is to ignore the principle of rhythm. Cause and effect. Every word and every gesture in a relationship sows consequences. A hurtful phrase can generate years of resentment. A tender gesture can heal deep wounds. Nothing goes without echo. Generation. Relationships are creative spaces. From the union of two wills, something new is born, a project, a family, a shared work. Every true relationship is ultimately an act of generation. History offers eloquent examples. One of the lesser known can be found in the letters of Abelard and Heloise, the famous lovers of the 12th century. Beyond the tragedy that marked them, their writings reveal how their minds fertilized one another. Heloise was not a passive disciple, but an active force that stimulated Abelard's thought. Their relationship, though marked by pain, shows the generative dimension of human encounter. In everyday life, our relationships confront us with our contradictions. We may believe ourselves patient until someone irritates us. We may believe ourselves generous until someone demands more than we give. Thus, the other becomes an involuntary teacher, showing us what we have not yet mastered. The Sufi sages used to say, "Your neighbor is your mirror. If he wounds you, ask yourself what wound in you he reflects." This teaching is not meant to justify another's injustice, but to invite us to discover in every relationship an opportunity for self-knowledge. A curious historical example appears in the chronicle of a Cistercian monastery in the 13th century. Two monks, in conflict over personal differences, were ordered by the abbot to work together in the vegetable garden for a whole year. At first they barely spoke, but over time they learned to coordinate their efforts and eventually became friends. The abbot had understood that the principles of rhythm and polarity could also be applied to conflicts. Constant friction, if endured with patience, can transform enmity into brotherhood. Love, understood in the broad sense, not only romantic but as a unifying force, is perhaps the most powerful field of application of the principles. All the laws come together there: mentalism, how we see the other; vibration, the energy we share; generation, the creation of a shared life; rhythm, the cycles of the relationship; polarity, the tension between autonomy and union. The Persian poet Rumi expressed it in a verse: "Love is the bridge between you and everything." That phrase, far from sentimental, contains a hermetic truth. Love is the field in which the principles intertwine most intensely. Human communities, from families to nations, also obey these laws. A notable example is the history of the city of Florence during the Renaissance. There, the interaction among rival families, artists, bankers, and thinkers generated a vibrant field of creativity. The polarity of conflicts, the rhythm of crises and periods of splendor, the generation of new ideas, all show how the principles manifest collectively. The practical application in our relationships can be summarized in 3 exercises. 1. Listen with conscious mentalism. Recognize that my idea of the other influences how I treat them. Before judging, ask myself, what image am I projecting onto them? 2. Accept rhythm and polarity. Do not expect everything always to be harmony. Highs and lows are part of a relationship. Learn to see conflict as an opportunity for transformation. 3. Sow new causes. Remember that every word is a seed. If I want to harvest respect, I must sow respect. If I want to harvest trust, I must sow trust. An anecdote from the Hebrew tradition illustrates this teaching well. 2 rabbis argued heatedly over a point of law. Finally, one of them said, "We are both right, but our reasons exist on different planes." They thus recognized the principle of correspondence. What seemed like contradiction was, in reality, vision from different levels. The art of relating, then, is not merely a social matter, but a spiritual one. For in encountering the other, the depth of who we are is revealed. Learning to live together is learning to recognize ourselves in the mirror, to accept oscillation, to sow consciously. True wisdom is measured not only in solitude, but in the fabric of relationships. He who governs himself discovers in the other an ally, even when he appears to be an adversary. He understands that every relationship is a laboratory where the universal principles are put to the test, and that in this laboratory we not only grow as individuals, but also generate shared worlds. The seeker who masters the art of relating becomes a bridge, uniting what was separated, harmonizing what seemed opposed, engendering what did not yet exist. Chapter 11. Principles in History and Power. If the Hermetic principles are reflected in the individual mind and in personal relationships, they manifest even more strongly in the history of peoples and in the exercise of power. Society is nothing more than an organism composed of millions of consciousnesses, and therefore it obeys the same universal laws. A glance at ancient civilizations already reveals this. Rhythm becomes evident in the cycles of rise and fall of empires: Egypt, Greece, Rome, Byzantium, the Chinese dynasties, the Islamic caliphates, all went through phases of birth, expansion, splendor, decline, and dissolution. What changes are the external forms. What remains is the pendular oscillation. Polarity also manifests itself in politics. In every society, there are opposing forces, conservatives and reformers, centralizers and decentralizers, rich and poor. These polarities, when managed with wisdom, generate balance and progress. When radicalized into irreconcilable enmity, they lead to fragmentation. A lesser-cited historical example is that of the Iroquois Confederacy in North America, formed before the arrival of Europeans. Several nations decided to unite under a common council of chiefs. There they applied in practice the idea of correspondence. What was decided had to be good, not only for the present, but also for the next 7 generations. That vision of reflection between now and the future sustained their society's stability for centuries. The principle of cause and effect in history is perhaps the most evident. No revolution arises from nothing. No war erupts without deep roots. The outbreak of the French Revolution, for example, was the accumulated effect of multiple causes: economic inequality, crisis of the monarchy, new philosophical ideas, and even poor harvests. What at first sight seems like an accident is in reality the result of a causal chain. The temptation of the powerful is often to ignore those deep causes and attend only to immediate effects. But history shows that what is unresolved always returns with greater force. Wise rulers are those who know how to read causes before the effects overflow. The principle of mentalism is reflected in the power of ideologies. Wars are not born only from armies, but from ideas that ignite in the collective mind. Nazism, communism, liberalism, religions, all are mental systems that become political and social realities. The collective mind creates worlds, just as the individual mind creates destinies. A striking example is the figure of Mahatma Gandhi. Without armies or weapons, he set in motion a monumental change in India, beginning with an idea: the power of nonviolence. That mental conviction generated a movement that overcame an empire. It is the principle of mentalism applied to history, the mind as cause of transformation. The principle of generation is seen in the cultural creativity of societies. Whenever 2 different currents meet, a new synthesis arises. The European Renaissance was born from the union of the Greco-Roman classical legacy, the medieval Christian heritage, and the influence of the Arab world. From that fusion came an explosion of art, science, and philosophy. Human history advances when different cultures fertilize one another. However, when the principles are ignored, power becomes tyranny. A ruler who forgets rhythm believes his dominion will be eternal. A people who forget polarity demonize the adversary until they destroy him. A society that denies cause and effect repeats the same mistakes. One example is the fall of Assyria in the 7th century BC. It was a powerful and feared empire, but its policy of extreme cruelty toward conquered peoples sowed such hatred that, when its enemies united, the destruction was total. The principle of cause and effect was fulfilled inexorably. They sowed violence and reaped violence multiplied. How can the principles be consciously applied to the social and political sphere? 1. Foresee historical rhythms. Understand that no era lasts forever. Prepare for changes instead of resisting them blindly. 2. Respect polarities. Accept the necessity of dissent as a source of balance and creativity, instead of seeking artificial uniformity. 3. Recognize deep causes. Address the roots of social problems. economic, cultural, spiritual, instead of merely punishing symptoms. 4. Foster correspondences. Think of future generations when making present decisions. 5. Raise collective vibration. Cultivate values, art, education, and rituals that inspire rather than degrade. 6. Use the mind as a tool of transformation. Generate ideas that uplift rather than manipulate. 7. Promote creative generation among cultures. Encourage encounters that give birth to new syntheses. In a medieval manuscript, a Dominican monk wrote, "The kingdom that does not heed the laws of heaven falls by the weight of its own earthly laws." Beyond its religious context, the phrase contains the intuition that human power cannot be sustained if it does not respect universal principles. History is not blind chance, but a stage where the principles unfold on a large scale. And just as in the individual mind rhythm and polarity govern, in society ideologies, collective cycles, and force conflicts govern. He who understands this can read history as a coherent book rather than a heap of accidents. Society is an expanded mirror of universal laws. What occurs in the individual soul also occurs in the history of peoples. To understand the principles in their collective dimension frees us from naivety and fatalism. It shows us that power is not mere chance, that history is not meaningless chaos, that society is a field of application of the same laws that rule the invisible. The seeker who contemplates history with these eyes not only learns from the past, but also becomes capable of sowing in the present the causes of a wiser future. Chapter 12. Science, Art, and the Flame of Creativity. If the universe is mind, then every human act of creation is a reflection of that universal mind. Art and science are not mere inventions of man, but extensions of the cosmic principles that operate within us. To create is to participate in the same impulse that gave birth to the stars, the seas, and life itself. The principle of mentalism is evident in every creative work. Before existing as an object, the painting existed in the painter's mind, the building in the architect's mind, the formula in the scientist's mind. The visible world arises from an invisible seed. Creativity is the most tangible proof that mind precedes form. Correspondence is manifested when art imitates nature, or when science discovers in the microcosm the same laws that govern the macrocosm. Leonardo da Vinci studied water eddies to paint hair and fabrics in motion. Kepler, in studying planetary orbits, discovered geometric correspondences that were repeated in music, the harmonies of the world. Vibration is the very principle of music. Every note is frequency, every chord is resonance. But painting, too, is based on vibrations of color, and poetry on vibrations of words. Art is organized vibration. Polarity appears in dramatic tension, in the contrast between light and shadow, in the struggle between thesis and antithesis that gives rise to synthesis. Art without polarity is flat. Science without polarity is sterile. Rhythm governs dance, poetry, and the seasons of scientific discovery. No genius produces endlessly. There are periods of fertile silence followed by bursts of creation. Cause and effect is seen in scientific research. Every hypothesis leads to an experiment. Every experiment generates results. Every result opens new questions. Nothing arises from nothing. Generation is the essential principle. From the encounter between intuition, the receptive principle, and method, the active principle, is born true creativity. In art, feminine sensitivity unites with masculine discipline. In science, creative imagination unites with logical rigor. A little remembered example is Omar Khayyam, the Persian poet, astronomer, and mathematician of the 11th century. In his verses, filled with beauty, one hears echoes of his astronomical understanding. In his star tables, echoes of his poetic sensitivity. Khayyam embodied the union of science and art as two expressions of the same universal mind. Human creativity is better understood when we see it as participation in a greater flow. The artist does not invent from nothing, but captures vibrations and translates them into form. The scientist does not create the laws of nature, but discovers them by attuning to the correspondence between his mind and the cosmos. A Renaissance manuscript attributed to Marsilio Ficino contained the phrase, "Genius does not invent, it remembers." In that sentence beats the intuition that the human mind, when creating, is remembering what already exists on the invisible plane. History abounds with examples where the principles reveal themselves clearly. The discovery of the structure of benzene by Kekulé is famous. He dreamed of a serpent biting its own tail, the alchemical symbol of the Ouroboros. That image, correspondence, polarity, circular rhythm, led him to the chemical formula. The unconscious offered the symbol, and reason translated it into science. Similarly, Albert Einstein recounted that his most brilliant ideas arose from intuitive images that he later had to translate into equations. There one sees the principle of generation, the union of the receptive, imagination, with the active, mathematics. Something similar occurs in art. Greek tragedy played with the principle of polarity, hero and destiny, freedom and necessity. Shakespearean theater intensified that tension to show how revelation is born from struggle. In painting, Caravaggio explored the vibration of light and shadow. In music, Bach organized rhythms and correspondences until he created a sonic universe many have called mathematics in motion. In the Japanese tradition of the haiku, 3 brief verses attempt to capture the correspondence between an instant of nature and an inner state. Rhythm is essential, syllables counted with precision. Polarity is suggested in minimal contrasts, snow falling and the silence of the heart, a crow flying over a rice field. Each haiku is the union of vibration, rhythm, and correspondence in miniature. Creativity also has a social dimension. When an entire community comes into tune with the principles, golden ages flourish. The Spanish Golden Age, the Florentine Renaissance, the French Enlightenment, all were moments in which collective vibrations favored the generation of immortal works. But when the principles are forgotten, decadence follows. Mental rigidity smothers creativity. Polarity turns into sterile enmity. The rhythm of ascent transforms into decline. The history of art and science is also a mirror of either obedience to or rupture with universal laws. How can this be applied in daily life? 1. Observe mentalism. Every creative project begins with an inner image. Cultivating imagination is sowing the future. 2. Seek correspondences. Observe nature and traditions to inspire new ideas. 3. Tune vibration. Choose music, words, and environments that elevate our creative frequency. 4. Accept polarity. Do not fear conflict or contrast. Creative tension is born from them. 5. Respect rhythm. Allow times of rest and incubation without forcing inspiration. 6. Understand cause and effect. Every attempt, even a failed one, generates lessons that bear fruit later. 7. Unite the active and the receptive. Discipline creativity with method while remaining open to the unexpected. A little-known story from the Neoplatonic philosopher Iamblichus tells that Greek artists considered their work as a descent of the muse. They did not claim all the merit. They knew themselves to be receivers of something greater. This humble attitude toward creativity reminds us that we are not the only agents, but channels of a universal flow. To create is to participate in the universal mind. Art and science are not luxuries, but necessary expressions of the principle of generation that permeates everything. In every painting, in every theory, in every melody, humanity recognizes itself as part of the creative impulse of the cosmos. The seeker who understands this no longer sees creativity as the privilege of a few, but as the right and duty of all. For every life, lived consciously, is also a work of art and of science, a unique way of embodying eternal principles in time. Chapter 13. The Path of the Sacred. The seeker's journey does not end with self-knowledge, relationships, or collective history. All of these are important, but for many human beings, there is a deeper dimension, the yearning for the transcendent. Spirituality is the attempt to consciously attune to the universal mind from which everything proceeds. The Hermetic principles offer a map for this quest. Mentalism. If all is mind, then the divine is not outside, but at the very origin of our thought. To seek God is, in a sense, to seek the root of mind. Correspondence. As above, so below. The sacred is reflected in the profane, the eternal in the temporal. Rituals are symbolic correspondences, earthly actions that evoke invisible realities. Vibration, prayer, chanting, mantras. These are ways of raising vibration to attune with higher frequencies. Polarity. The mystic experiences the tension between immanence and transcendence, between nearness and distance from the divine. Rhythm. Souls go through cycles, spiritual dryness, ecstasy, doubt, illumination. Recognizing this rhythm prevents despair in moments of darkness. Cause and effect. Every act of devotion, every meditation, every service sows causes that bear effects in the soul. Generation. Mystical union is often described as a spiritual marriage. The human spark unites with the divine fire to engender a new life. A little remembered example is found in the Hesychast tradition of Eastern Orthodox monks. They practiced the so-called prayer of the heart, repeating a phrase endlessly while regulating their breathing. In doing so, they sought to enter into correspondence with the heartbeat of the universe. Prayer was not seen as an external petition, but as a vibration harmonizing the mind with the divine. Mystical experience is often expressed through metaphors of union. St. John of the Cross spoke of the dark night that precedes the encounter with the beloved. In the Sufi tradition, Rumi described the seeker as a lover dancing until lost in the presence of the beloved. Alchemists represented union with the symbol of the androgynous figure, where masculine and feminine fuse into wholeness. All of these images reflect the principle of spiritual generation, the union of the human spark with the divine source to give birth to a renewed being. Other traditions reveal surprising parallels. Tantric Buddhism explicitly uses the principle of polarity. The union of male and female deities symbolizes the fusion of wisdom and compassion, mind and method. Far from being superficial erotic metaphors, these are symbols of the integration of opposites into the absolute. The principle of rhythm is seen in the history of great saints and mystics. Teresa of Avila described periods of dryness in which prayer seemed sterile, followed by moments of intense clarity. The same appears in the writings of the Desert Fathers, who spoke of acedia, a kind of spiritual weariness, alternating with experiences of light. The seeker who understands rhythm does not lose heart in dryness, knowing it is part of the cycle. The principle of correspondence invites us to see the sacred in the everyday. A Japanese mystic of the 15th century, Ikkyu, taught that washing a bowl or watching a crow could be as sacred as meditating in a temple. His irreverent poetry sought to show that the divine is not confined to solemn rituals, but corresponds to every gesture of life. An Islamic tale tells of a dervish who was asked, "Where is God?" The dervish replied with another question, "Where is he not?" The phrase sums up the principle of mentalism in its spiritual dimension. If all is divine mind, then the divine permeates every particle of the universe. The problem is not its absence, but our blindness to recognize it. In spiritual practice, vibration is fundamental. Gregorian chant in the Christian tradition, mantras in Hinduism, the Sufi zikr repeated in dancing circles, all are ways of using sound vibration to alter consciousness. This is not about aesthetics, but about transformation. Ordered vibration opens the mind to subtler frequencies. The principle of cause and effect also applies to spiritual ethics. Every action, even the smallest, is a seed that bears fruit. Buddhism speaks of karma, Christianity of sowing and reaping. Both point to the same truth. Spiritual laws are as inexorable as physical ones. The seeker should not expect arbitrary miracles, but should understand that cosmic justice operates silently. Mysticism is not an escape from life, but an intensification of it. The true seeker does not flee the world, but contemplates it as a temple. He sees in every relationship a correspondence, in every pain a rhythm, in every encounter a polarity pointing toward unity. Spirituality thus becomes a gaze that transfigures the everyday. A fascinating example appears in the memoirs of the Flemish mystic Hadewijk of the 13th century. She describes visions in which she experienced God as an ocean of love in which my being dissolved like a drop. Beyond the particular tradition, her experience embodies the principle of mentalism taken to its extreme. The individual mind recognizing itself as part of the infinite mind. The spiritual path, according to the principles, is not linear but spiral. The seeker undergoes trials, returns to steps already taken, but each time at a deeper level. The spiral is rhythm and correspondence, polarity and generation. It is not about advancing in a straight line, but about deepening in rising circles. Spirituality is not escape, but conscious participation in the universal mind. The seeker who applies the principles to his inner life becomes a mystic in the broadest sense, one who recognizes the sacred in all things and unites with the source through thought, vibration, polarity, and generation. The ultimate mystery may remain veiled, but the principles allow us to walk with meaning, to see life as sacrament, the cosmos as temple, and one's own heart as the altar where the human and the divine meet. Chapter 14. The Seeker's Legacy. We have explored the Hermetic principles from multiple perspectives: the individual, relationships, history, creativity, and spirituality. Now it is time to integrate everything learned into a unified vision. The deeper message is both simple and inexhaustible. Life is neither chaos nor chance, but the expression of universal laws. To understand them is to learn to walk with greater wisdom, without attempting to control everything, but also without resigning ourselves to passivity. The 7 principles, mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, and generation, are not abstract formulas, but practical keys that illuminate every dimension of existence. Mentalism reminds us that everything begins in the mind. Our ideas, images, and beliefs are seeds that germinate into reality. The conscious seeker cultivates thought as one tends a garden. Correspondence teaches us that nothing is disconnected. What happens in the small reflects the great. By knowing ourselves, we know the universe. By observing the universe, we discover aspects of our own soul. Vibration shows us that everything is in motion. We can tune in to elevated frequencies or sink into lower ones. The conscious choice of our environment, words, and emotions is an act of power. Polarity reveals that opposites are not enemies, but extremes of the same. Learning to reconcile them rather than deny them brings balance. Rhythm reminds us that everything flows in cycles. To know how to wait in calm, to enjoy ascent without pride, and to endure descent without despair, is the art of wisdom. Cause and effect teaches us responsibility. Every act generates consequences. Nothing happens without reason. To sow consciously is to guarantee a just harvest. Generation reminds us that everything arises from the union of forces. The seeker integrates the active and the receptive, the masculine and the feminine, will and openness to give birth to new realities. Lived together, these principles become a compass. They do not promise to eliminate pain or challenges, but they show us how to face them with greater clarity. They allow us to move from being victims to becoming conscious collaborators in the work of the cosmos. A historical example illustrates this synthesis well. Giordano Bruno, Renaissance philosopher, intuited that the universe was infinite and that every star was a sun with worlds around it. His vision brought him into conflict with established powers, and he was condemned to the stake. But before dying, he declared, "Perhaps you pronounce this sentence with greater fear than I receive it." His life embodied several principles: mentalism, the force of an idea capable of defying empires; polarity, the tension between faith and reason; rhythm, the later rebirth of his ideas; generation, the union of philosophy and cosmology to create a new vision. Although his body was destroyed, the seed of his thought bore fruit in future generations. The seeker who arrives at the end of this journey should not see it as closure, but as the beginning of his or her own practical path. Every day offers a laboratory for applying the principles. Upon waking, we can choose what thoughts to feed the mind, mentalism. In our actions, we can observe how the inner is reflected in the outer, correspondence. In our emotions, we can care for the vibration we radiate. In conflicts, we can recognize polarity and seek balance. In life cycles, we can accept rhythm. In our decisions, we can sow conscious causes. And in our projects, we can integrate the active and the receptive to generate something new. A text by the Roman philosopher Seneca says, "It is not that we have little time, but that we waste much." The phrase gains new meaning in the light of the principles. Every instant is a seed, every action a creative act. To waste time is to forget that we are collaborators in the work of the universe. In the Eastern tradition, we also find echoes of this vision. A Zen master, asked about the ultimate meaning of life, replied, "To eat when I am hungry, to sleep when I am tired." The disciple protested, "But everyone does that." The master concluded, "Not everyone does it with full awareness." The response summarizes the practical application of the principles. It is not about seeking the extraordinary, but about living the ordinary with full awareness of the laws that sustain it. The seeker's legacy, then, is not to accumulate theories, but to embody the principles in his or her life. Each person who does so becomes a spark of transformation in their environment. A clear mind inspires clarity in others. A balanced life generates harmony in the community. Perhaps we will never resolve all the mysteries of the universe, but that does not matter. What is essential is to live in tune with them. The principles invite us to stop fighting against the current and learn to navigate it with grace, to turn life into art, action into sewing, relationships into mirrors, pain into a teacher, creativity into service, spirituality into union. Understanding the principles is the beginning. Applying them is the path. Embodying them is the goal. And then we discover that the universe, far from being a hostile enigma, is an ally inviting us to dance with its rhythm, to vibrate with its music, to create with its generative power. The seeker who lives in this way ceases to be a passive spectator and becomes a co-author of the great work. And in that act, he understands what sages have repeated in 1,000 languages and symbols. The universe is within you, and you are within the universe. You have been listening to The Keys of Infinity, Universal Principles of Hermeticism, written by Oscar Gonzalez and produced by Biblio Studio. Thank you for listening.